In 1933, a Russian freight vessel was assigned a bold mission to traverse the Arctic Ocean along Russia's northeastern frontier in an effort to open up a long-term shipping lane called the Northeast Passage. However, just like many previous attempts, the ship became ensnared in the thickening winter ice and was immobilized for months, drifting helplessly with the undercurrents. Then, in February, a loud groaning echoed from within the ship's hull. The captain, realizing the danger, instantly ordered the crew to evacuate onto the ice. This marks the harrowing journey of the SS Chelyuskin. For countries bordering the top of the globe, the Arctic holds immense national and strategic value. Russian interest in this frozen expanse dates back to 1648, when a small group of Cossacks sailed along the Bering Strait and circled northeastern Russia. Their voyage debunked the belief that Asia and North America were connected by land, proving instead that water separated the continents. The possibility of a northern sea corridor, later known as the Northeast Passage, was further validated. If a working sea route across the northern coast of Asia could be realized, it would offer a far more direct path between Europe and the Pacific Ocean. But throughout the following centuries, exploratory voyages continued to face insurmountable hurdles, brutal winters and ice-choked waters. Ships frequently became icebound, forced to overwinter and wait for the spring thaw. Centuries later, after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the Soviet Union rolled out sweeping development agendas. One major initiative focused on opening and developing what was called the Northern Sea Route. Siberia had been found to be abundant in resources, and this route could streamline the transportation of goods and people throughout the vast Russian territory. But navigating the ice-ridden northern seas remained a major obstacle. To overcome this, the Soviets began deploying the recently invented icebreakers, specialized ships with reinforced hulls, shaped to split through the ice. Alongside these vessels, aircraft began playing a role as well. Carried on board, planes were lifted onto temporary ice airstrips, from which they would scout ahead to identify the safest paths. By the late 1920s, the Arctic was generating national pride. Both pilots and captains gained public acclaim, and the government began taking Arctic navigation seriously. In 1932, the Soviet regime established an Arctic Commission to conduct comprehensive studies of the region. Leading this team was Professor Otto Schmidt, an esteemed mathematician from Moscow State University, a skilled geographer, and head of the state's scientific publishing department. He was also an avid mountaineer and had previously led research missions to Franz Josef Land, a remote Arctic archipelago. On those journeys, his passion for Arctic exploration grew. That year, Otto was given a landmark assignment: complete a full passage through the Northern Sea Route within a single season. His vessel, an icebreaker, departed from Murmansk and journeyed across Russia, eventually reaching the Bering Strait and the seas north of Japan. Despite suffering a broken propeller shaft midway, the mission was a success, thanks to an improvised sail. This outcome proved to the Soviet leadership that such a route was viable. However, a critical issue remained. Traditional icebreakers weren't designed for long-haul shipping or large-scale cargo transport. A new vessel was needed, one that could handle the ice yet carry substantial freight. So, in 1933, Otto Schmidt was tasked with undertaking the same mission, but this time aboard a new cargo ship, the SS Chelyuskin. Freshly built, the Chelyuskin was stronger than standard cargo ships. Otto referred to it as a semi-icebreaker. Its frame was specially reinforced, twice as powerful as the average vessel, and its living quarters were insulated for potential winter entrapment. Yet it lacked the engine power of a true icebreaker and wasn't peaked made for enduring heavy pack ice. Nonetheless, it was the most capable option available. Joining Otto on this second voyage was the same captain from the prior year. The ship officially began its mission on July 12, 1933, departing from Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg. After reaching Copenhagen on July 16 to calibrate the engines, the ship continued to Murmansk for a final stop before heading into Arctic waters. The journey through the Russian Arctic spans 6 major seas. The first, Barents Sea, was ice-free and calm. This region remains the mildest due to the warm North Atlantic current. The Kara Sea, next in the path, posed the first danger. The Chelyuskin collided with sea ice that dented and cracked the stern plating. Though the ship pressed on, the damage raised concern as worse conditions lay ahead. But amid this tension, joy arrived. As the ship neared Cape Chelyuskin, one of the 4 women aboard gave birth to a baby girl named Karina. By September, the Chelyuskin had become one of 11 vessels to pass Cape Chelyuskin that year, more than the total in all previous years combined, showcasing how aggressive Soviet efforts were to activate this passage. Of all those ships, the Chelyuskin was the only one that wasn't a full icebreaker. Next came the Laptov Sea and then the East Siberian Sea. Both were nearly completely iced over, 90 to 100% coverage. Fortunately, it was still early autumn, and the ice was thin enough to navigate with only minor hull repairs needed. But upon reaching the Chukchi Sea, the final stage before the Bering Strait, conditions became dire. The previous year's icebreaker had suffered engine failure here. This time, the Chelyuskin encountered even thicker ice. They managed to push through for a while, but their pace slowed dramatically. At one point, a reconnaissance flight showed open water just 16 miles away, but it was unreachable. On September 21st, the Chelyuskin stopped completely. The ice gripped the ship, bending its rudder 20 degrees. From that point, the ship could do nothing but drift eastward within the ice, toward a bay northeast of the Bering Strait. This bay funnels drifting ice into a narrow inlet, compressing it further. Additionally, frequent whiteouts made aircraft assistance nearly impossible. With limited choices, the crew braced themselves for a prolonged wait and redirected their focus to maintenance. Then, on October 1st, through the blinding snow, Otto heard the sound of dogs barking, growing louder until dog sleds appeared. It was a rescue party of Chukchi natives. One of them had seen the stranded vessel and organized a sled team to reach them, traveling 25 kilometers across treacherous terrain. Otto, with help from a translator, negotiated with them. The Chukchi were willing to transport some crew members to the icebreaker Litka, moored far down the coast. But with few sleds and more than 100 people aboard, only a handful could be taken. Otto selected a seriously ill sailor who needed urgent medical help, plus 6 others with pressing obligations. As the sleds departed, Otto began building an emergency camp on the ice. But on October 5th, a sudden wind shift fractured the ice beneath the setup site. The men working outside barely made it back on board before water engulfed the area. Yet, miraculously, the Chelyuskin began drifting again, and the rudder had been fixed. Spirits rose. That hope was short-lived. Within hours, the ice reclaimed its grip. From then on, the Chelyuskin drifted aimlessly, locked in shifting ice near the Bering Strait's mouth with no clue whether freedom was near. By November 3rd, the ship was drifting into the strait itself but remained immobilized. At times, it floated south past the St. Lawrence Islands between Alaska and Russia, only to be pulled back north by powerful currents. During one rapid northern drift, Otto feared they were being dragged deep into the Arctic Circle. If so, they might not escape until the following year, and the ice might crush the hull before then. Earlier, Otto had contacted the Litka for aid, but they reported their engines were underperforming, making it nearly impossible to break through the dense pack ice. On November 10th, as the situation grew increasingly dire, Otto sent out a desperate plea to the Litka for assistance. He understood the risks involved for them but felt he had exhausted all other options. Despite the perilous conditions, the captain of the Litka committed to helping in any way he could. Initially, he attempted to push through the ice directly, but the half-powered ship couldn't make the passage. They then tried navigating around the edge of the ice sheet, which was closer to the Chelyuskin, but that effort also failed. The ice conditions rapidly worsened, growing thicker and broader. The Litka's captain proposed anchoring at the edge of the ice, allowing the Chelyuskin's crew to walk across to safety. Unfortunately, the ice gap had widened to 50 kilometers, making this unfeasible. Another possibility was to airlift the crew, but the aircraft skidded on takeoff and sustained irreparable damage. With that final hope gone, Otto sorrowfully asked the Litka to cease its rescue attempts. Meanwhile, the ice floe entrapping the Chelyuskin drifted unpredictably, sometimes west, other times east. For a period, it even hovered near the Chukchi Sea coast. In December, there was a brief thaw that allowed movement, but they soon got stuck again. By then, the sun had vanished for the long polar night, leaving them in near total darkness for months. Surprisingly, darkness wasn't their worst problem. Otto and his crew had never expected to remain trapped all winter, which meant their coal supply would not last. They had to find ways to reduce consumption. The ship's chief mechanic took charge, offering bonuses to stokers who conserved coal. He then experimented with shutting off the heating system for 8 hours daily, but this led to moisture forming inside the living quarters. Switching to 2-hour intervals proved more effective. Eventually, he devised a substitute fuel using paraffin, crude oil, waste oil, animal fats, and anything else they could scavenge. This allowed essential areas to stay warm and reduced their dependency on coal. Water soon became another pressing issue. They ran out in late November and were forced to start melting ice for drinking water by December. Crew members took on the task of collecting ice to be melted in the boiler. As some problems were brought under control, the crew adapted to their strange new life. They even found ways to enjoy it, using skis to scout landing areas for aircraft and for recreation. Some raced around the ship on marked ski tracks. They held hunting contests, and in the evenings, Otto gave lectures on modern scientific theories, followed by music and singing from those who brought instruments. By February 1934, they had drifted to the center of the Chukchi Sea, and the ice was becoming heavier and more dangerous. Otto sensed the Chelyuskin was in grave danger. On February 12th, the ship's engineer and his team inspected the hull, as the ice was jostling the ship more than usual. Despite 24-hour darkness, there was a brief twilight in which they examined the vessel during a 40-degree blizzard. No damage to the hull was found, but they did notice a large crack in the ice near the front right section of the ship. This signaled a dangerous shift in the ice sheet. The next day at 1 p.m., the ship started to shudder violently. Within 20 minutes, the crack widened, and ice began crushing the Chelyuskin. It first pushed the vessel backward until there was no space left, then squeezed it even tighter. The right side of the ship began collapsing, with the engine room and bunkers crushed. The upper deck bulged and split apart, while the crew was tossed around by violent tremors. Eventually, the ship leaned sharply to the left, giving the crew a brief moment of calm. Otto had prepared for this. Emergency supplies had already been brought on deck, so he ordered the crew to quickly move them to shore. Planks were laid across the tilted deck, and supplies were slid down and dragged to a pre-set-up tent. Once the critical items were safe, everyone had 5 minutes to grab personal belongings. An hour and a half after the first jolt, another massive impact hit the ship. One section collapsed, and a series of smaller jolts followed as water flooded the compartments. The added weight pulled the bow underwater, and waves crashed over the front of the ship. In the chaos, a final radio message was sent, then the equipment was dismantled, and essential personnel evacuated. Otto, the captain, and about a dozen others frantically threw remaining supplies onto the ice. The animals on board panicked and scattered. They were ultimately slaughtered and tossed overboard to be used later as food. Water surged onto the passenger deck and the ship dipped forward. The captain called for immediate evacuation. Everyone fled. Otto and the captain barely made it to the gangway as parts of the upper deck collapsed. A gangway plank snapped, throwing the captain down to the ice. Others leapt from any height to escape. The last person on board was the quartermaster, who reached the side just as the vessel flipped violently, hurling its rudder and engine into the air. Debris fell on him, knocking him unconscious. Seconds later, the Chelyuskin vanished beneath the sea, taking the quartermaster with it. Shocked and grieving, the survivors gathered themselves. Otto prioritized setting up the radio tent, followed by sleeping quarters, and then a meal. On the morning of February 14th, they assessed the damage. Surprisingly, barrels of fuel and materials had floated up from the wreck. Otto assigned crew members to salvage as much as they could. They reassembled the radio, re-established contact, and a rescue plan was developed. A government task force decided to extract as many people as possible by air, with dog sleds and air support aiding the rest. The survivors were stranded 130 kilometers from shore, their closest destination, Cape Van Karum. From there, they would head to Alaska, then return to Russia via London and Berlin. To make this possible, their first task was to construct an airstrip on the ice where planes could land. That became the primary focus in camp. They used every available resource to make the airstrip as secure and functional as possible. Knowing it would be several months before help could reach them, they focused on maintaining the runway. This turned out to be especially difficult due to the constantly shifting ice. In total, the ice beneath the runway broke 13 times, forcing them to either repair or completely relocate their base each time. While this was going on, Otto was managing the rescue logistics, deciding who would be flown out and who would travel by dog sled. Some women were upset when they discovered Otto had assigned them plane seats alongside the 4 children and anyone showing signs of illness. Their frustration stemmed from having worked as hard as the men and feeling others less capable should have been prioritized. But Otto stood firm. The planes were reserved for women, children, and the sick. For now, their task was simple: keep the airstrip intact and wait. They named their temporary settlement Camp Schmidt. Reaching Camp Schmidt by air proved to be just as dangerous as the voyage through the Northern Sea route. On February 14th, the day after the Chelyuskin sank, a pilot named Sigismund Levanevsky heard the news over his radio. A respected and experienced aviator, he suspected a rescue mission would involve aircraft, so he wired Moscow offering his help. The next morning, officials contacted him and confirmed his involvement in a special operation. He was briefed on the rescue plan and told the departure point would be Alaska. Since this was pre-Cold War, the Americans agreed to lend the Soviets a few aircraft to assist in rescuing their people. A coordinated rescue effort was launched, aiming to move quickly before the ice began to thaw in spring, making landings impossible. Sigismund, along with Arctic explorer Georgy Ushakov, traveled to Fairbanks, Alaska, where they would launch the operation. On March 26th, they took off on their first flight, planning to cover 500 miles to reach the town of Nome, Alaska, near the Bering Strait. Midway, their speed dropped dramatically as though the wind was working against them. Sigismund radioed to ask about conditions ahead and was told a blizzard was beginning. They were forced to turn back and wait for better weather. 2 days later, they made another attempt, despite the local weather station being offline. Time was running out as the ice beneath Camp Schmidt weakened daily. Initially, conditions were manageable, but visibility worsened. Clouds thickened, and Sigismund had to fly dangerously low, using telegraph poles as visual guides to reach Nome. Miraculously, he landed safely. The next leg involved crossing the Bering Strait to reach Cape Van Karum on Russia's far eastern tip. They set off the following day under promising weather reports. The flight along the Russian coastline went smoothly until they reached the Chukchi Peninsula. Visibility dropped to nearly nothing. Sigismund descended, hoping to spot a landing site, but with no luck. He ascended to 5,000 feet, relying only on his compass and eyesight. Soon, a snowstorm engulfed the plane. It shook violently, and ice formed rapidly on the windows. Georgy passed Sigismund a note. The aircraft was icing over. Sigismund tried to ascend above the storm, but the higher altitude brought colder air, worsening the situation. The plane became heavier and harder to control. Eventually, the engines started to backfire. One by one, the instruments failed. Sigismund could no longer gauge his speed or altitude. Realizing they were descending rapidly, he steered them away from nearby hills, hoping to find flat terrain. At last, they spotted the coastline and ice below. He turned inland and, approaching what he hoped was solid ground, pulled the controls back hard to avoid a crash landing. The plane slammed into the ice and Sigismund blacked out. When he regained consciousness, Georgi was urgently shaking him. Georgi dragged him from the wreckage and tended to a deep head wound. Fortunately, their crash site was just off the same bay where the Chelyuskin had been stranded months earlier. Locals in the area sheltered the pair, and the next day, they arranged transportation to Cape Van Karum by dog sled. Meanwhile, other pilots began flying missions and had better luck. As Sigismund and Georgi traveled, another pilot, flying an American-lent aircraft, successfully reached the designated landing zone. That narrow weather window didn't last, and conditions worsened until April 7th. Once the storms passed, planes flew to meet Georgi at Cape Van Karum. Upon landing, Georgi instructed one pilot to unload his supplies and take aboard 8 sled dogs and a sled to transport crew members who couldn't be flown out. The pilot departed for Camp Schmidt and landed on the icy strip a few hours later. After unloading the dogs and repairing minor damage to the aircraft, he returned with passengers. This successful trip was followed by many more. 7 pilots in total, including Sigismund, flew multiple rescue runs between Cape Van Karum and the makeshift airfield, evacuating 55 people by plane in April. The rest of the crew was safely transported by sled. Though they had endured 8 long months trapped in Arctic ice, only 1 life was lost: the quartermaster who went down with the Chelyuskin. Following the rescue, all pilots were honored with the title Hero of the Soviet Union. The Soviet government declared the expedition a success, having finally reached the Bering Strait. They soon began building sturdier cargo ships and resumed shipping along that route by 1935. However, even with today's advanced vessels, icebreakers, and changing climate, the Northern Sea route remains inconsistent, plagued by ice, extreme conditions, and sparse Arctic infrastructure. In 2006, pieces of a ship discovered 50 meters below the Chukchi Sea were confirmed to be remnants of the Chelyuskin. If you've stayed with the story this long, thank you for watching. If you have suggestions for future stories, feel free to submit them using the form linked in the description. I hope to see you in the next one.